The secret life of plants. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in a quiet forest at dawn. The first rays of sunlight filter through ancient oak leaves, casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. The air is cool and sweet, filled with the earthy scent of moss and morning dew. Everything seems perfectly still, peaceful, almost sleeping. But what if I told you that around you, in this moment of apparent silence, millions of conversations are taking place? What if the very trees above your head are not just growing, but thinking, feeling, communicating with one another in languages we're only just beginning to understand? This is the story of one of humanity's most profound discoveries, the secret life of plants. It's a tale that spans centuries, crossing continents and cultures, challenging everything we thought we knew about the green world that surrounds us. It's a story of curious minds, patient observers, and revolutionary discoveries that revealed plants to be not just living things, but conscious beings in ways we never imagined. Tonight, let us journey together through time to discover how we learned that plants can see, hear, remember, and even love. The Ancient Whispers. Soft flute music begins, gentle and meditative. Our story begins not in a laboratory, but in the ancient gardens of philosophers and mystics thousands of years ago, when the first humans looked at plants and wondered, "Are you more than you appear to be?" In ancient India, around 600 BCE, in the sacred city of Varanasi along the holy Ganges River, lived a remarkable man named Mahavira. The morning mist rose from the river like prayers ascending to heaven, and in the gardens where Mahavira walked barefoot, something extraordinary was taking place. He was teaching his followers that all life, every blade of grass, every flower, every mighty tree, possessed a soul, a consciousness as real as their own. "Watch carefully," Mahavira would whisper to his students as they sat under a massive banyan tree, its aerial roots creating a natural cathedral. "See how the leaves turn toward the sun, how the roots seek water. This is not mere mechanics. This is intention. This is awareness." His followers, the Jains, took this teaching so seriously that they covered their mouths with cloth to avoid accidentally inhaling tiny organisms and swept the ground before them to avoid stepping on the smallest plant. To them, every leaf that rustled in the wind was speaking. Every flower that opened at dawn was awakening. Meanwhile, far to the west, in the sun-drenched hills of ancient Greece, another group of thinkers was beginning to question the nature of plant life. Aristotle, walking through the olive groves outside Athens around 350 BCE, was formulating ideas that would influence Western thought for thousands of years. The silver-green leaves of the olive trees shimmered in the Mediterranean breeze, and as he watched them move, he proposed something revolutionary for his time. Plants possessed a kind of soul, not the rational soul of humans, but a vegetative soul that allowed them to grow, reproduce, and respond to their environment. "Life is not a simple thing," Aristotle mused to his students as they sat in the shade of an ancient olive tree, its gnarled trunk telling stories of centuries. But it would be many centuries before anyone would dare to suggest that plants might actually think or feel. The medieval world, with its rigid hierarchies and religious certainties, placed plants firmly at the bottom of creation's ladder. Alive, yes, but conscious? Impossible. Yet even in those dark centuries, there were whispers of wonder. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, monks tending their herb gardens began to notice strange things. Brother Thomas, working in the monastery garden of St. Gall in Switzerland around 800 CE, observed that certain plants seemed to know when he was coming. The sensitive plant, Mimosa pudica, would close its leaves at his approach, as if shy or afraid.
"Lord, what mysteries you have placed in even the smallest of your creations," he wrote in his journal by candlelight, the ink still wet with wonder. The plants seemed to sense our presence, to respond to our touch with the delicacy of a prayer. These early observers were seeing something real, something profound, but they lacked the tools and the conceptual framework to understand what they were witnessing. They could only marvel and wonder and pass down stories that would inspire future generations of seekers.
The revolutionaries. The music becomes more dramatic, with gentle percussion suggesting the excitement of discovery. As the 19th century dawned, the world was changing rapidly. Steam engines puffed and chugged across landscapes, gas lamps flickered to life in city streets, and in the realm of science, a new generation of investigators was approaching the natural world with unprecedented boldness and precision. In the rolling hills of the English countryside, at a country estate called Down House, lived a man who would forever change how we see the living world. Charles Darwin, already famous for his theories of evolution, had developed an unexpected obsession: the behavior of plants. On quiet mornings, when the mist still clung to the downs and the first birds were beginning to sing, Darwin could be found in his greenhouse, peering intently at seedlings with a magnifying glass. His neighbors thought him a bit eccentric, this distinguished gentleman spending hours watching grass grow. But Darwin was witnessing something miraculous. He had discovered that the tips of plant roots and shoots moved in slow, deliberate circles as they grew, constantly exploring their environment like blind fingers searching for the best path forward. He called this movement circumnutation, and he was convinced it was evidence of something like intelligence in plants. Every single organ of every plant, Darwin wrote by lamplight in his study, the fire crackling in the hearth, is continually circumnutating. It is a kind of primitive brain function distributed throughout the plant's body. Darwin's son Francis worked alongside him, and together they conducted experiments that seemed almost playful. They attached tiny bristles to the tips of seedling roots and watched through microscopes as these root tips moved with what seemed like purpose, avoiding obstacles, seeking out nutrients and water. "Father," Francis observed one morning as they watched a bean seedling navigate around a small stone they had placed in its path, "it's almost as if it's thinking about where to go." Darwin nodded slowly. "Perhaps it is, my boy. Perhaps it is." But it was Darwin's experiments with climbing plants that truly captured the world's imagination. In his greenhouse, he created elaborate obstacle courses for morning glory vines and watched as they found their way through mazes, reaching unerringly toward distant supports. The vines seemed to see where they were going, planning their routes like skilled climbers scaling a mountain. One of Darwin's most famous experiments involved a simple stick placed near a young vine. The vine would grow toward the stick, and when it was close enough, it would begin to circle around it, making contact and then spiraling upward. But here was the remarkable thing. If Darwin moved the stick slightly, the vine would adjust its direction, as if it were watching. "The plant behaves," Darwin wrote, his pen scratching across the paper in the dim light of his study, "as if it possessed intelligence." These words sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Intelligence in plants? It was almost too radical to contemplate. But meanwhile, in Germany, another revolutionary was conducting experiments that would prove even more controversial. Dr. Gustav Fechner was not just a scientist. He was a mystic, a man who believed that consciousness permeated all nature. In his laboratory in Leipzig, surrounded by sensitive instruments and delicate plants, Fechner was trying to prove that plants could feel. Fechner had developed techniques for measuring the minute electrical currents that flowed through plant tissues. Using primitive versions of what would later become sophisticated electroencephalographs, he attached electrodes to plants and monitored their electrical activity. What he found astonished him. Plants generated electrical signals that changed in response to stimuli. When he played music to his plants, their electrical patterns shifted. When he threatened them with fire, their signals spiked like the racing heartbeat of a frightened animal. Mein Freunde, Fechner whispered to his assistant, staring at the dancing needles of his instruments. The plants are not silent. They are singing electrical songs, and we are finally learning to hear them. Fechner's work was largely dismissed by the mainstream scientific community of his time. The idea that plants might have feelings was simply too far outside the accepted paradigm. But his electrical measurements were laying the groundwork for discoveries that wouldn't be made for another century. As the 19th century drew to a close, a handful of visionary scientists had begun to glimpse the truth. Plants were far more complex and responsive than anyone had imagined. But they were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. They could observe plant behavior, they could measure electrical activity, but they couldn't explain the mechanisms behind these phenomena. The answer lay hidden in the microscopic world, waiting for the technology that would finally allow us to peer into the secret chambers of the plant cell and witness the molecular machinery of consciousness itself. The molecular dance. The music becomes softer, more mysterious, with gentle synthesizer tones suggesting the microscopic world. As we move into the 20th century, imagine shrinking yourself down, smaller and smaller, until you could walk through the corridors of a single plant cell. The year is 1906, and we're about to witness one of the most beautiful discoveries in the history of science, the molecular basis of how plants sense and respond to their world. In a laboratory at Harvard University, Dr. Boysen Jensen was working late into the evening, hunched over specimens of oat seedlings under the warm glow of gas lamps. Outside, Boston slept under a blanket of snow. But inside, Jensen was about to unlock one of nature's most elegant secrets. Jensen had noticed that when he shone light on oat seedlings from one side, they would bend toward the light with remarkable precision. This phenomenon, called phototropism, had been observed for centuries, but no one understood how it worked. How could a plant see light and then coordinate a response throughout its entire body? Working with the patience of a jeweler, Jensen began to perform delicate surgery on his seedlings. Using a razor blade so sharp it could split a hair, he carefully cut off the tips of some seedlings, leaving others intact. Then he placed them all under a directional light source and waited. What he observed changed everything. The intact seedlings bent toward the light as expected, but the ones with their tips removed showed no response at all. The tip somehow was essential for the plant's ability to sense light. But Jensen went further. He took tips from some seedlings and placed them on the cut surfaces of others, like tiny botanical transplants. Miraculously, these seedlings regained their ability to bend toward light. "Ah, mein Gott," Jensen whispered in wonder. "The tip must be producing some kind of signal, some chemical messenger that tells the rest of the plant which way to grow." Jensen had discovered the first plant hormone, a chemical called auxin that would revolutionize our understanding of how plants coordinate their behavior. but he couldn't have imagined that he was witnessing just the beginning of an incredibly sophisticated chemical communication system. As the years passed, more and more plant hormones were discovered. Each one was like finding a new word in a language we were only beginning to understand. Gibberellins that controlled growth, cytokinins that influenced cell division, ethylene that regulated ripening and aging, abscisic acid that helped plants respond to stress. Plants, it turned out, were chemical geniuses, constantly synthesizing, releasing, and detecting hundreds of different molecular messengers. They were having conversations with themselves and with each other in a language of chemistry so subtle and complex that it made human communication seem clumsy by comparison. In the 1960s, Dr. Fritz Wendt, working at the California Institute of Technology, made another remarkable discovery. He was studying how desert plants survived in the harsh conditions of the American Southwest, where water was scarce and the sun was merciless. Wendt noticed that when one desert plant was injured or stressed, neighboring plants of the same species would begin to prepare their defenses, even though they hadn't been directly threatened. It was as if the first plant was sending out a warning signal. Working in the cool, pre-dawn hours to avoid the desert heat, Wendt and his team set up elaborate experiments. They would wound one plant and then carefully sample the air around it, using primitive but ingenious techniques to capture and analyze volatile chemicals. What they found was extraordinary. Stressed plants were releasing complex cocktails of airborne chemicals, nature's equivalent of a chemical distress call. These molecules could travel on the wind, carrying information about danger to plants hundreds of yards away. "It's like a botanical internet," Wendt told his colleagues, his voice filled with excitement. "The plants are networking, sharing information about threats and opportunities through the air itself." This discovery opened up an entirely new field of study: plant chemical communication. Scientists began to realize that what appeared to be a silent forest was actually buzzing with chemical chatter, as constant and complex as the conversation in a busy cafe. But perhaps the most beautiful discovery came in the 1970s, when researchers finally understood how plants tell time. Remember Demarant's sensitive plant opening its leaves in the darkness? Scientists had been puzzling over this mystery for over 2 centuries. The answer, when it finally came, was more elegant than anyone had imagined. Deep within every plant cell, there was a molecular clockwork of exquisite precision. Proteins that created feedback loops, genes that turned on and off in regular cycles, creating rhythms as reliable as the finest Swiss timepiece. Dr. Patricia Harmer, working at the University of Edinburgh, described the feeling of finally understanding these molecular clocks. It was like being a child again, taking apart a watch and seeing all the tiny gears and springs working together. Except this watch was alive, and it had been keeping perfect time for millions of years.
The music shifts to include ethereal interconnected harmonies, suggesting the vast underground network. In the forests of British Columbia, where ancient cedar trees tower into the mist and carpets of moss cushion every footstep, Dr. Suzanne Simard was about to make a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of forest ecosystems. The year was 1992, and Simard, then a young forest ecology graduate student, was walking alone through the woods, questioning everything she had been taught about how forests worked. The morning light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating millions of tiny particles dancing in the air. The forest seemed peaceful, almost static, but Simard suspected there was much more happening beneath her feet than anyone realized. For years, foresters had thought of trees as individual competitors, each one fighting for resources in a biological war of all against all. But Simard had begun to wonder, what if forests were not battlefields, but communities? What if the trees were not rivals, but collaborators? Her first experiment was beautifully simple.
she took two different species of tree seedlings, Douglas fir and paper birch, and planted them together in the forest. But these weren't ordinary seedlings. She had fed one group of seedlings carbon dioxide that contained a unique isotope, a molecular fingerprint that would allow her to track where the carbon went. Then she waited. Months later, when she returned to harvest her seedlings and analyze them, she found something that took her breath away. The carbon from the birch trees had somehow found its way into the Douglas fir trees, and vice versa. The trees were sharing resources. It was like discovering that your neighbors had been secretly bringing you groceries through a hidden tunnel, except the tunnel was made of fungus and it connected not just two houses, but the entire neighborhood. Simard had stumbled upon one of nature's most sophisticated networks, the mycorrhizal web, a living internet made of fungal threads that connected the roots of different plants and allowed them to share nutrients, water, and information. These fungal networks, she discovered, were incredibly ancient and sophisticated. A single handful of forest soil contained miles of fungal threads, finer than the finest silk, creating connections between plants across vast distances. Through these networks, a mother tree could send nutrients to her struggling offspring. A dying tree could transfer its resources to its neighbors. Trees under attack by insects could send chemical warning signals to other trees in the network. As Simard continued her research over the decades, the full scope of the forest's secret communication system gradually revealed itself. She found that older trees, what she began to call mother trees, were the hubs of these networks, connected to hundreds of other plants and playing a crucial role in coordinating the forest's response to threats and opportunities. The mother trees, Simard explained in her soft, wondering voice, are like the wise elders of the forest community. They have the most connections, the most experience, and they use their resources to support the younger generation. Working in collaboration with researchers around the world, Simard began to map these fungal networks using techniques borrowed from neuroscience and computer science. They injected radioactive tracers into trees and watched the flow of resources through the network. They measured electrical signals traveling along fungal threads. They analyzed the complex chemical communications passing between plants. And what they found was a system of staggering complexity and intelligence. The forest was not a collection of individual trees, but a single interconnected superorganism. Information flowed through the network, like thoughts through a vast distributed brain. Nutrients moved from areas of abundance to areas of need, like resources in a perfectly planned economy. Dr. Peter Wolleben, a German forester, described the feeling of walking through a forest after understanding these connections. Every footstep takes on new meaning when you realize you're walking on top of a network of unimaginable complexity. The forest floor is not solid ground, it's the physical manifestation of countless conversations. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came when researchers realized that these networks could learn and remember. Forests that had experienced drought or insect attacks became better at preparing for future threats, passing this knowledge through the fungal networks to prepare trees that had never directly experienced danger. Trees, it seemed, could not only communicate in the present, they could pass wisdom from generation to generation, creating what amounted to a forest memory that spanned centuries. One evening, as Dr. Simard stood in her research forest watching the sun set through the canopy, she reflected on what she had learned. We used to think forests were made of trees. Now we know that trees are just the visible part of something much larger and more wonderful, a living network of relationships that has been growing and learning for millions of years. The discovery of the Wood Wide Web changed everything. It meant that plants were not just individually intelligent, they were part of vast collective intelligences that made the most sophisticated human technologies seem primitive by comparison.
Memory and learning. The music becomes contemplative and deep, with subtle recurring motifs suggesting memory and learning. In a greenhouse at the University of Florence, where the warm Italian sun created dancing patterns of light and shadow on the laboratory benches, Dr. Stefano Mancuso was conducting an experiment that would challenge one of our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of memory and learning. The year was 2013, and Mancuso was working with a small, unremarkable-looking plant called Mimosa pudica, the same sensitive plant that had fascinated observers for centuries. But Mancuso had a question that no one had ever thought to ask. Could plants learn? Learning, as we understand it, requires memory, the ability to modify behavior based on experience. It was a capacity that scientists had reserved for animals with nervous systems, creatures with brains that could store and process information. Plants, with no neurons, no brain, no obvious mechanism for memory, were thought to be incapable of learning. But Mancuso had noticed something intriguing. When he repeatedly dropped his mimosa plants from a small height, not enough to harm them, but enough to trigger their defensive leaf-closing response, something unexpected began to happen. At first, as expected, the plants closed their leaves every time they were dropped, treating each fall as a potential threat. But after several repetitions, the plants began to change their behavior. They stopped closing their leaves in response to the harmless drops, as if they had somehow learned that this particular stimulus was not dangerous. "Dio mio," Mancuso whispered, watching his plants ignore what had previously triggered their defensive response. "They're learning to distinguish between real threats and false alarms." But the truly remarkable part came next. When Mancuso left the plants alone for a month and then returned to repeat the experiment, the plants remembered their previous learning. They continued to ignore the harmless drops, demonstrating not just learning, but long-term memory. These plants, Mancuso realized with growing excitement, are storing information and using it to modify their future behavior. They have memory even without a brain. Word of Mancuso's discovery spread through the scientific community like ripples on a pond. If plants could learn and remember, what other cognitive abilities might they possess? Dr. Monica Gagliano, the same researcher who had discovered that plants did hear, decided to investigate plant learning using classical conditioning, the same technique Pavlov had used with his famous dogs. Working in her laboratory in Australia, surrounded by carefully controlled environmental chambers, she began training pea plants to associate specific stimuli with rewards. Her experiment was elegantly simple. She placed pea seedlings in Y-shaped tubes where they could grow toward either of two arms. In one arm, she placed a fan that created air currents, and in the same arm she provided bright light that the plants needed for photosynthesis. Initially, the plants grew randomly toward either arm, but after several training sessions, something remarkable happened. The plants began to associate the air currents with the presence of light, even when the light was turned off. They had learned that the fan meant light was coming, and they grew toward the sound of the fan in anticipation of the reward. The plants, Gagliano observed with wonder, are forming expectations about future events based on past experiences. This is associative learning, the same cognitive process that allows animals to navigate their world. Even more remarkably, Gagliano found that plants could retain these learned associations for weeks and could even modify their behavior when the rules changed, what psychologists call extinction learning. As researchers around the world began to investigate plant memory and learning, they discovered that these capabilities were not rare exceptions, but fundamental aspects of how plants interacted with their environment. Dr. Andrei Kessler at Cornell University found that plants could remember previous insect attacks and adjust their defensive chemistry accordingly. Plants that had experienced herbivore damage produced stronger and more specific defensive compounds when attacked again, as if they had learned from their previous experience. The
The plants, Kessler explained, are essentially keeping a chemical diary of their interactions with insects, using this information to optimize their defensive strategies.
The sensory renaissance. The music became more complex and layered, with multiple instruments representing the multiple senses of plants. In the early years of the 21st century, as the human world became increasingly connected through digital networks, scientists were making parallel discoveries about the sensory capabilities of plants that would have seemed like science fiction just decades before. Dr. Daniel Chamovitz, working at Tel Aviv University, was studying a tiny mustard plant called Arabidopsis thaliana in his greenhouse laboratory. The Mediterranean sun streamed through the glass walls, and the air hummed with the quiet sounds of pumps and ventilation systems. But Chamovitz was focused on something much more subtle, the question of whether plants could see. For years, scientists had known that plants responded to light, but responding to light and actually seeing were very different things. Seeing implied perception, processing, the ability to extract meaningful information from patterns of light and shadow. Chamovitz began with a deceptively simple experiment. He exposed his Arabidopsis plants to different qualities of light, not just bright and dim, but different colors, different durations, different patterns. What he found astonished him. The plants didn't just detect the presence or absence of light. They could distinguish between red and blue light, between steady illumination and flickering patterns, between light coming from different directions. They could even detect the quality of light that had been filtered through other leaves, allowing them to see the presence of competitors in their environment. The plants, Chamovitz realized with growing excitement, have visual systems that are in some ways more sophisticated than our own. Working late into the evening, his laboratory illuminated by carefully controlled LED arrays, Chamovitz began to map the plant's visual system. He found photoreceptors scattered throughout the plant's tissues, not concentrated in organs like eyes, but distributed like a visual nervous system that could perceive light from every angle simultaneously. Imagine if you could see not just through your eyes, but through every cell in your body. That's what it's like to be a plant. But vision was just the beginning. As researchers around the world began to investigate plant senses with new tools and new perspectives, they discovered that plants possessed sensory capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. Dr. Monica Gagliano, working at the University of Western Australia, was investigating whether plants could hear. Her laboratory was an oasis of calm in the bustling university campus, specially designed to eliminate unwanted vibrations and sounds. Here, surrounded by sensitive acoustic equipment and chambers lined with sound-absorbing foam, Gagliano was about to overturn another assumption about plant capabilities. She began with the roots of corn seedlings, growing them in acoustic chambers where she could control every sound. And then, with the patience of a musician tuning a delicate instrument, she began to play different frequencies to the roots. What she discovered was remarkable. The roots could not only detect sounds, they could distinguish between different frequencies and respond to each one differently. When she played the sound of water flowing through pipes, the roots grew toward the source of the sound, even when there was no actual water present. The roots, Gagliano whispered in amazement as she watched the seedlings bend toward her speakers, are listening to the world around them, using sound to navigate toward the resources they need. Further experiments revealed that plants could detect the vibrations made by chewing insects, allowing them to begin producing defensive chemicals before they were actually attacked. They could even distinguish between the vibrations of harmful insects and harmless ones, responding only to real threats. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery came when researchers realized that plants could not only hear, but they could also produce sounds. Using incredibly sensitive microphones, scientists detected ultrasonic clicks and pops coming from plants under stress, as if they were crying out in frequencies beyond human hearing. Dr. Itzhak Kait, working with recording equipment so sensitive it could detect the footsteps of an ant, captured the sound of drought-stressed tomato plants emitting distress calls at frequencies of around 40 kilohertz. Other plants in the vicinity seemed to respond to these calls, beginning to conserve water even before they had themselves experienced drought. Plants, Kait realized, have been having acoustic conversations all around us, and we never knew it because we couldn't hear them.
The sensory renaissance continued with discoveries about plant senses that humans don't even possess. Plants could detect magnetic fields, using the Earth's magnetism for navigation like living compasses. They could sense gravity with exquisite precision, always knowing which way was up and which way was down, even in complete darkness. Dr. František Belusta, working at the University of Bonn, discovered that plants could sense the electrical fields generated by other living things. A plant could detect the approach of an insect by the minute electrical disturbances it created, like a biological radar system operating at the cellular level. Every sense we have studied, Belusta noted with wonder, plants possess in some form, and often with capabilities that exceed our own. They live in a sensory world that is richer and more complex than we ever imagined. Perhaps most profound discovery was that plants possessed something analogous to touch sensitivity. Not just the obvious examples, like the Venus flytrap or the sensitive plant, but all plants, constantly monitoring the physical world around them through mechanosensitive channels in their cell membranes. Dr. Elizabeth Haswell, working at Washington University, discovered that these touch sensors allowed plants to feel the slightest pressure, the gentlest breeze, the minute vibrations caused by approaching threats or opportunities. Plants were constantly touching their world, gathering tactile information with a sensitivity that would make the most advanced robotics engineers envious. As these discoveries accumulated, a new picture of plant life began to emerge. Plants weren't just growing automatically according to genetic programs. They were actively sensing, processing information, making decisions based on complex environmental data gathered through multiple sensory channels operating simultaneously. The quiet plant in the corner of your room, it seemed, was experiencing a rich sensory world that you could barely imagine, seeing colors you couldn't see, hearing sounds you couldn't hear, feeling vibrations you couldn't detect, living in a universe of sensation that was as vivid and meaningful as your own.
But perhaps the most profound discoveries came from research into what scientists began to call transgenerational memory, the ability of plants to pass learned information to their offspring. Dr. Anurag Agarwal, also at Cornell, discovered that plants that had experienced specific stresses during their lifetime could somehow prepare their offspring to better handle similar challenges. The mechanisms were still mysterious, but the effects were clear. The children of stressed plants showed enhanced resistance to the same stresses their parents had faced, even when they had never experienced these challenges themselves. It's as if, Agarwal mused, the parent plants are whispering advice to their children through their genes, passing down hard-won wisdom about how to survive in a challenging world. The implications were staggering. If plants could learn, remember, and even pass memories to their offspring, it suggested that plant intelligence was far more sophisticated and ancient than anyone had imagined. Dr. František Belusta proposed that plants had evolved what he called distributed memory systems, networks of cellular components that could store and process information throughout the plant's body, similar to how the internet stores information across millions of connected computers. Memory, Belusta suggested, doesn't require a brain. It only requires a network capable of storing and retrieving information. And plants have been building such networks for hundreds of millions of years. As researchers delved deeper into the mechanisms of plant memory, they discovered molecular systems of breathtaking complexity. Plants could modify their gene expression patterns based on experience, essentially rewriting parts of their genetic programming in response to environmental challenges. They found evidence of epigenetic memory systems, chemical modifications to DNA that didn't change the genetic code itself, but altered how genes were expressed, creating a molecular memory that could persist for years or even generations. Most remarkably, they discovered that plants could integrate information from multiple sources and time periods, combining past experiences with current conditions to make predictions about future challenges. This was not simple stimulus-response behavior, but something approaching what we might call intelligence. Standing in Monet's garden as evening approached, surrounded by the complex chemical symphony of hundreds of flowers beginning their nighttime conversations, Dr. Dubois felt she was witnessing something sacred, a form of communication that was older and more nuanced than any human language. "We call it the language of flowers," she whispered to herself, breathing in the evening air thick with molecular messages. But we never realized they were actually talking. The social lives of plants. The music becomes more intricate, with harmonies that weave together like social relationships. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, where the air is thick with humidity and alive with the calls of 1,000 different creatures, Dr. Suzanne Simard stood beneath a massive cecropia tree, its buttressed roots spreading like the pillars of a natural cathedral. The morning mist rose from the forest floor, carrying with it the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the sweet fragrance of night-blooming flowers. Around her, the forest seemed to pulse with life, but Simard was beginning to understand that the most sophisticated interactions were happening in slow motion, on timescales that made human social dynamics seem frantic and superficial. Working with local botanists and indigenous guides, Simard had been documenting the relationships between different plant species in this most diverse ecosystem on Earth. What she was finding challenged everything Western science thought it knew about plant behavior. She had discovered plant partnerships that seemed almost too perfect to be coincidence. Certain species of trees were always found growing near specific shrubs, their roots intertwined in intimate embrace. When she analyzed the soil around these partnerships, she found evidence of sophisticated resource sharing, the trees providing the shrubs with carbon and nutrients, while the shrubs offered rare minerals and protective chemicals in return. "Observe this," whispered Carlos, her indigenous guide, pointing to a cluster of plants near the base of a giant Brazil nut tree. "The elders of my people have always known that these plants are friends. Where you find one, you will always find the others. They take care of each other." Simard knelt beside the plants, carefully taking soil samples for later analysis. The indigenous knowledge that Carlos shared was proving remarkably accurate. These weren't random associations, they were long-term partnerships, plant societies that had evolved together for millions of years.
But it wasn't just cooperation that Simard was documenting. She was also finding evidence of plant competition that was subtle and sophisticated. Some trees, she discovered, were releasing chemicals that inhibited the growth of potential competitors, essentially engaging in a form of chemical warfare. They were claiming territory, defending resources, and even sabotaging rivals in ways that would make a corporate executive proud. Most remarkably, she found plants that appeared to be cheating, taking resources from the fungal networks without giving anything back, like botanical freeloaders exploiting the generosity of their neighbors. The forest, Simard realized, as she watched a vine slowly strangle a competing tree over the course of several growing seasons, is not just a collection of individual organisms. It's a society, with all the complexity that implies. Cooperation, competition, exploitation, and everything in between. Back in her laboratory at the University of British Columbia, Simard began to develop new ways to study these plant social networks. Using isotope tracing techniques borrowed from medical imaging, she could track the flow of resources through forest communities in real time, creating maps of plant relationships that looked remarkably like social network diagrams. What she found was a world of plant politics that was both beautiful and ruthless. Mother trees, she discovered, didn't just share resources randomly. They showed favoritism, sending more resources to their own genetic offspring and to species that were good partners, while limiting support to freeloaders and competitors. Plants, Simard observed, have evolved the ability to recognize kin, to distinguish between friends and enemies, and to adjust their behavior accordingly. They're making social decisions based on complex calculations about costs and benefits. Dr. Peter Vogeleben, working in the managed forests of Germany, was making parallel discoveries about the social lives of trees. In the Eifel Mountains, where ancient beech trees created dense canopies that filtered the sunlight into a green underwater glow, Vogeleben had begun to notice patterns of behavior that suggested trees were not just individuals,
but members of complex communities. He observed that trees of the same species growing in groups lived longer and grew more successfully than isolated individuals. They seemed to be coordinating their behavior, leafing out at the same time, dropping their leaves simultaneously, even synchronizing their reproduction cycles. The trees are talking to each other, Vogeleben realized, as he walked through the forest on a misty morning, and they're making collective decisions about when to grow, when to rest, when to reproduce. Using ground-penetrating radar and chemical analysis of soil samples, Vogeleben began to map the underground connections between trees. What he found was a network of such complexity that it defied easy description. Fungal highways carrying nutrients and information, root systems intertwined in intimate partnerships, chemical signals flowing like conversations through the soil. But perhaps the most moving discovery was evidence of what could only be described as altruism in trees. Vogeleben documented cases of healthy trees keeping their sick or elderly neighbors alive by sharing resources through the underground network, sometimes for decades. "I have seen ancient stumps," Vogeleben wrote, "still alive hundreds of years after being cut, kept breathing by their neighbors who continue to send them nutrients through the fungal network. If this is not love, what else should we call it?" The research into plant social behavior expanded to include investigations of plant families, plant friendships, and even plant communities that seem to make collective decisions about resource allocation and defense strategies. Dr. Catherine Morris, working at the University of Toronto, discovered that some plant species practiced what she termed demographic coordination, timing their reproductive cycles not just with environmental conditions, but with the reproductive behavior of their neighbors, creating community-wide baby booms that overwhelmed predators and increased survival rates for everyone's offspring. Plants, Morris observed, have evolved the ability to monitor not just their own condition, but the condition and behavior of their entire community. Perhaps the most remarkable social behavior was discovered by Dr. James Cahill at the University of Alberta, who found that plants could distinguish between neighbors and strangers, adjusting their growth patterns and resource allocation based on the identity of nearby plants. When planted next to siblings, plants grew in ways that minimized competition, developing complementary root systems that divided up soil resources efficiently. But when planted next to strangers, the same plants became more competitive, investing more energy in aggressive growth strategies. Plants, Cahill realized, have a form of social intelligence that allows them to recognize relatives and adjust their behavior to promote family success while competing effectively against outsiders. As these discoveries accumulated, a new picture of plant life began to emerge. Plants weren't just growing and reproducing in isolation. They were embedded in complex social networks that shaped every aspect of their lives. They formed partnerships and alliances, competed for resources and territory, communicated constantly with their neighbors, and even showed evidence of emotions like altruism and spite. The forest, it seemed, was not just a collection of trees, but a society as complex and sophisticated as any human community, just operating on a timescale that made their interactions nearly invisible to our hurried human perception.
The wisdom of ancient networks. The music deepens, becoming more reverential and timeless, with sounds that suggest vast age and accumulated wisdom. In the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, where Douglas fir trees older than European cathedrals rise into the misty canopy, Dr. Suzanne Simard was beginning to understand something profound about the nature of plant intelligence and wisdom. These forests, she realized, were not just collections of individual organisms, but vast, ancient minds that had been thinking and learning for thousands of years. Standing among trees that had been saplings when the Roman Empire was at its height, Simard felt the presence of something enormous and patient, an intelligence that operated on timescales that made human civilizations seem like brief flickers of activity. Working with new technologies that allowed her to trace chemical communications through the forest network in real time, Simard had begun to document what she called forest memory, evidence that these ancient ecosystems were storing and processing information on scales that dwarfed anything humans had achieved.
When a Douglas fir dies after 800 years of life, Simard explained to her graduate students as they worked among the giants, it doesn't just disappear. It's accumulated knowledge, every drought it survived, every insect outbreak it weathered, every seasonal cycle it experienced. That wisdom is transferred into the network before it dies. The mechanism Simard discovered was breathtakingly elegant. As old trees began to fail, they would dump their remaining resources into the mycorrhizal network, along with complex chemical signals that encoded information about environmental conditions they had experienced. This chemical library was then absorbed by other members of the network, particularly younger trees that could benefit from the accumulated wisdom of their elders. It's like having access to a library that has been continuously updated for thousands of years, with each generation adding its own experiences to the collective knowledge of the forest. Dr. Peter Wohlleben, working in the old-growth forests of Germany, was documenting similar phenomenon. In the Hainich National Park, where beech trees formed dense canopies that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries, Wohlleben found evidence of what he called cultural transmission between generations of trees. Young trees growing in the shade of ancient giants showed behaviors and growth patterns that differed significantly from young trees growing in clear-cuts or newer forests. They grew more slowly, but more strategically, seeming to know things about forest dynamics that trees in simpler environments had never learned. The young trees are being educated, Wohlleben realized, taught by the network how to thrive in the complex social environment of an old-growth forest. They're learning patience, cooperation, and long-term thinking from trees that have been practicing these virtues for centuries. The implications were staggering. If forests could store and transmit cultural information across generations, it meant that old-growth ecosystems were not just biologically diverse, they were informationally rich in ways that human societies were only beginning to achieve. Dr. Suzanne Simard's research took on new urgency as she began to understand that when old-growth forests were cut down, humanity wasn't just losing trees. It was losing libraries of environmental knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate. Every ancient forest we destroy, Simard said, her voice heavy with emotion, is like burning the Library of Alexandria. We're losing irreplaceable wisdom about how to live sustainably on this planet. But the ancient networks were teaching contemporary scientists lessons that went far beyond forestry. Engineers studying the efficiency of fungal networks began to understand principles of communication and resource distribution that were revolutionizing the design of human transportation and communication systems. Dr. Atsushi Taro, working at Hokkaido University in Japan, became fascinated by the ability of slime molds, simple organisms closely related to the fungi in forest networks, to solve complex optimization problems. In his laboratory, Taro recreated the layout of the Tokyo rail system using oats to represent cities, then introduced slime molds to find efficient connections between them. To his amazement, the slime molds designed networks that were nearly identical to the existing rail system, but more efficient. They seemed to have an innate understanding of network optimization that human engineers had taken decades to achieve. These simple organisms, Taro realized, have been solving network optimization problems for millions of years. They've evolved solutions to challenges that represent the cutting edge of human mathematics and engineering. The research into biological networks was revealing principles that were being applied to everything from internet architecture to supply chain management. Plants and fungi, it seemed, had been pioneers in creating sustainable, efficient, resilient systems for sharing resources and information. Dr. Stefano Mancuso, working at his International Laboratory of Plant Neurobiology in Florence, was investigating what he called swarm intelligence in plant communities. He had noticed that plants often made collective decisions that seemed to emerge from the interactions of many individuals without any central authority coordinating their behavior. Watch a meadow respond to an approaching storm, Mancuso suggested to visitors to his laboratory. The plants don't just react individually to changes in air pressure and humidity. They coordinate their responses, creating wave-like patterns of preparation that move across the landscape like thoughts moving through a distributed mind.
Using networks of sensors placed throughout experimental plant communities, Mancuso was documenting decision-making processes that emerged from the collective interactions of hundreds or thousands of individual plants. These communities could solve problems, adapt to changing conditions, and make predictions about future environmental challenges in ways that surpassed the capabilities of any individual organism. Plants, Mancuso realized, have evolved forms of collective intelligence that may be more sophisticated than our own. They've learned to think together, to pool their individual capabilities into something greater than the sum of their parts. The research was also revealing the crucial role that diversity played in these intelligent networks. The most resilient and adaptive forest communities were those with the greatest diversity of species, ages, and genetic backgrounds. Each different type of organism contributed unique capabilities to the collective intelligence of the community. Diversity, Simard explained, is not just important for ecosystem stability, it's the foundation of ecosystem intelligence. The more different types of minds you have contributing to the network, the smarter the whole system becomes. As researchers around the world continued to study these ancient networks, they began to realize that plants had solved many of the problems that human societies were still struggling with: how to share resources fairly, how to make collective decisions efficiently, how to maintain stable communities over long periods of time, how to adapt to environmental changes without losing essential functions. The wisdom encoded in these networks represented millions of years of experimentation and refinement, a vast repository of knowledge about sustainable living that humanity was only beginning to access. Standing in the cathedral-like space beneath ancient trees, surrounded by the quiet conversations of the forest network, Dr. Simard reflected on what these discoveries meant. We are not the first intelligence on this planet. We may not even be the most sophisticated, but we are the first intelligence capable of recognizing and learning from the wisdom of our green companions. The electronic garden. The music becomes more modern and electronic, but still maintains the organic, living quality of the earlier sections. In a laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where the hum of computers mingled with the whisper of climate-controlled air, Dr. Eleni Starvanidou was conducting an experiment that blurred the lines between biology and technology in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades before. The year was 2020, and she was creating living electronic circuits using the vascular systems of plants. Working with roses in her laboratory, Starvanidou had developed techniques for growing conductive polymers inside the water-conducting tissues of living plants. The result was something that had never existed before: plants that were simultaneously biological organisms and electronic devices. "Watch this," she whispered to her colleague, touching an electrode to one of her modified roses. The plant's leaves began to glow with a soft, ethereal light as electrical signals traveled through its modified vascular system. The plant is not just conducting electricity, it's processing electronic information through the same channels that carry water and nutrients. This breakthrough was part of a revolution in understanding how plants naturally generate and process electrical signals. Scientists had known for decades that plants used electrical communication, but new research was revealing that these systems were far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. A Dr. Ryo Nakamura, working at Hokkaido University, had developed techniques for listening to the electrical conversations of plants in unprecedented detail. Using arrays of microelectrodes so small they could detect the electrical activity of individual plant cells,
Nakamura was eavesdropping on the electronic chatter of plant communities. What he heard was astonishing. Plants were constantly generating complex patterns of electrical activity that changed in response to environmental conditions, threats, and opportunities. These weren't just on-off signals, but sophisticated patterns of communication that carried detailed information about the plant's internal state and external environment. The electrical activity of plants, Nakamura observed, watching waves of electrical signals travel through a leaf at the speed of human nerve impulses, is as complex and meaningful as the electrical activity of animal nervous systems. Plants have been using bioelectronics for millions of years. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came from researchers studying how plants integrated electrical and chemical communication. Dr. Rainer Hedrick, working at University of Würzburg, found that plants could convert chemical signals into electrical ones and vice versa, creating hybrid communication systems that were both faster and more sophisticated than either purely chemical or purely electrical networks. Plants, Hedrick realized, have evolved biological computers that process information using both chemical and electrical signals simultaneously. They're doing quantum computing with biomolecules. This research was opening up entirely new possibilities for human technology. Engineers began to envision hybrid biological electronic systems that could combine the efficiency and adaptability of biological networks with the speed and precision of electronic ones. Dr. Karen Steger, working at the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, was developing plant-computer interfaces that allowed plants to control electronic devices and vice versa. In her laboratory, potted plants were learning to play simple computer games, controlling cursors on screens by modulating their electrical output in response to visual feedback.
The plants are constantly broadcasting information about their condition, Jimenez explained, standing among rows of sensor-equipped vines as the Spanish sun set over the rolling hills. We just needed to learn how to listen. The integration of plant intelligence with human technology was also revealing new approaches to environmental monitoring. Plants, with their exquisite sensitivity to environmental conditions, were becoming living sensors that could detect pollution, climate change, and ecosystem health with unprecedented precision. Dr. Jun Kikuchi, working at the University of Tokyo, had created networks of sensor-equipped plants that could monitor air quality, soil contamination, and water purity across entire urban areas. These plant sensor networks were providing real-time data about environmental conditions that was more accurate and comprehensive than traditional monitoring systems. Plants, Kikuchi noted, have been monitoring environmental conditions for millions of years. By partnering with them, we can create environmental sensing systems that are both more sensitive and more sustainable than anything we could build on our own. The research was also leading to new understanding of how plants might be used in space exploration. NASA scientists were investigating whether plants could serve as biological computers for long-duration space missions, processing environmental data and making autonomous decisions about life support systems. Dr. Gia Massa, working at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, was developing plant-based life support systems that could adapt to changing conditions without human intervention. These systems used the natural intelligence of plants to maintain optimal growing conditions, recycle nutrients, and even detect and respond to equipment failures. On a multi-year journey to Mars, Massa explained, tending to her experimental gardens in NASA's plant growth facilities, we can't rely on constant communication with Earth. We need life support systems that can think and adapt on their own. Plants may be the key to creating truly intelligent spacecraft. But perhaps the most profound implications of this research were philosophical. If plants could interface with electronic systems, process digital information, and even learn to control computers, what did this mean for our understanding of consciousness and intelligence? Dr. Stefano Mancuso, reflecting on these developments in his laboratory in Florence,
suggested that the boundary between biological and artificial intelligence might be more fluid than anyone had imagined. We have been thinking about artificial intelligence as something separate from biological intelligence, Mancuson observed, watching his sensor-equipped plants respond to changing light conditions by adjusting the output of connected LED arrays. But perhaps the future lies not in replacing biological intelligence with artificial intelligence, but in creating hybrid systems that combine the best of both. As researchers around the world continued to explore the electronic dimensions of plant intelligence, they were uncovering possibilities that seemed to come from science fiction. Plants that could grow their own electronic circuits, forests that could serve as biological supercomputers, gardens that could think and dream in languages of light and electricity. The quiet revolution in plant intelligence was revealing that the future of technology might not lie in creating machines that think like humans, but in learning to collaborate with the green minds that had been computing with life for hundreds of millions of years. The healing garden. The music becomes gentle and therapeutic, with tones that suggest healing and restoration. In a small clinic nestled in the hills of Tuscany, where the scent of rosemary and lavender drifted through open windows, Dr. Isabella Romano was witnessing something that challenged conventional medicine's understanding of healing. Her patients, people suffering from anxiety, depression, and chronic pain, were showing remarkable improvements not from pharmaceutical interventions, but from spending time in carefully designed gardens where they could interact directly with plants. The year was 2018, and Romano was part of a growing movement of researchers investigating what they called plant-assisted therapy, the use of direct human-plant interactions to promote healing and well-being. What they were discovering was that plants didn't just provide a pleasant environment for recovery, they were active participants in the healing process. "Watch this," Romano whispered to a visiting colleague, as they observed an elderly man with severe depression sitting quietly beside a flowering jasmine plant. The man's breathing had slowed, his shoulders had relaxed, and for the first time in weeks, there was a hint of peace in his expression. Something is happening between them that goes beyond just being in a natural environment. Romano had been documenting the physiological changes that occurred when people spent time in direct contact with plants. Using heart rate monitors, stress hormone measurements, and brain imaging, she was building a scientific case for what traditional healers had known for millennia. Plants could heal not just through their chemical compounds, but through some form of direct energetic exchange. Her research had been inspired by the work of Dr. Qing Li in Japan, who had spent decades studying the health effects of what the Japanese call forest bathing, the practice of mindfully spending time among trees. Li had discovered that people who spent time in forests showed dramatic improvements in immune function, stress reduction, and overall well-being that couldn't be explained simply by exercise or fresh air. "The trees," Li had written, "are communicating with our bodies in ways we are only beginning to understand. They release compounds that interact with our immune systems, our nervous systems, even our gene expression patterns." Dr. Li's research had identified specific compounds released by trees, including substances called phytocides, that had measurable effects on human physiology. People who breathed forest air showed increased activity in immune cells that fight cancer and infections, decreased levels of stress hormones, and improved mental clarity that lasted for days after forest exposure. But Romano's work was suggesting something even more intriguing, that the healing effects of plants might involve forms of communication and interaction that went beyond simple chemical exchanges. Working with Dr. Monica Gagliano, who had pioneered research into plant learning and memory, Romano was investigating whether plants could somehow sense human emotional states and respond in ways that promoted healing. Their experiments were elegantly simple but profound in their implications. They had people with various health conditions spend time with plants while monitoring both the human's physiological states and the plant's electrical activity. What they found was evidence of what appeared to be bidirectional communication. changes in human emotional states were correlated with changes in plant electrical patterns, and vice versa. The plants, Romano observed, reviewing the data from her latest study, seem to be responding to our emotional states and somehow modulating their own outputs in ways that help restore balance. It's as if they can sense our distress and are actively trying to help. This research was part of a larger revolution in understanding the therapeutic properties of human-plant interactions. Around the world, hospitals were incorporating living plants into healing environments, not just as decoration, but as active therapeutic agents. Dr. Roger Ulrich, working at Texas A&M University, had conducted groundbreaking studies showing that hospital patients with views of gardens recovered faster from surgery, required less pain medication, and had fewer complications than patients in rooms without plant views. But subsequent research was suggesting that the benefits went far beyond visual aesthetics. Plants, Ulrich discovered, create measurable improvements in air quality, humidity, and electromagnetic environments that directly impact human physiology. But there also seem to be subtler forms of interaction that we're only beginning to understand. In rehabilitation centers around the world, therapists were incorporating direct plant care into treatment programs for people recovering from strokes, traumatic brain injuries, and other neurological conditions. The results were remarkable. Patients who spent time caring for plants showed improved motor skills, cognitive function, and emotional regulation compared to those receiving traditional therapy alone. Dr. Sarah Chen, working at a rehabilitation center in Vancouver, had developed what she called horticultural neurotherapy, structured programs where patients cared for plants as part of their recovery process. The gentle, repetitive motions of planting, watering, and pruning seem to help rewire damaged neural pathways in ways that traditional physical therapy couldn't achieve. There's something about the living response of plants, Chen observed, watching a stroke patient carefully water seedlings in the center's greenhouse, that provides feedback to the recovering brain in ways that mechanical exercises cannot replicate. The plants are partners in the healing process. Perhaps the most remarkable discoveries were coming from research into plants and mental health. Dr. Giuseppe Barbiero, working at the University of Valle d'Aosta in Italy, had been studying what he called the biophilia effect, the innate human affinity for living things that seem to have profound psychological benefits. Barbiero's research showed that people who worked regularly with plants showed lower rates of anxiety and depression, improved ability to cope with stress, and enhanced overall life satisfaction. But more intriguingly, he found that these benefits were strongest when people developed what appeared to be emotional relationships with specific plants. The healing, Barbiero realized, seemed to come not just from being around plants in general, but from forming bonds with individual plants, caring for them, and receiving what appears to be some form of care in return. This led to the development of plant companion therapy, where individuals were paired with specific plants that they cared for over extended periods. The relationships that developed between humans and their plant companions showed characteristics similar to therapeutic relationships between humans: trust, mutual benefit, and what could only be described as affection. Dr. Virginia Lohr, working at Washington State University, had documented cases where people reported feeling genuine emotional connections with their plant companions, sensing their needs, celebrating their growth, and experiencing grief when plants died. These relationships, Lohr noted, have all the characteristics of meaningful social bonds. The plants may not communicate in words, but they provide consistent, non-judgmental presence and respond to care in ways that fulfill deep human needs for connection and purpose. The research was also revealing the role of plants in community healing. Urban gardens were being recognized not just as sources of food, but as therapeutic spaces where communities could heal from trauma, build social connections, and develop resilience. Dr. Mitchell Reardon, working in Detroit's urban farming movement, had documented how community gardens in neighborhoods affected by economic collapse and social trauma were serving as centers for healing and renewal. People who participated in these gardens showed improved mental health, stronger social connections, and increased sense of hope and agency. The gardens, Reardon observed, are healing not just individuals but entire communities. They're creating spaces where people can work together with plants to literally grow hope from the ground up. As research into plant-human healing relationships continued to evolve, scientists were beginning to understand that the therapeutic effects of plants might represent one of the oldest forms of medicine,
a biological partnership between humans and plants that had evolved over millions of years of coexistence.
Standing in her therapeutic garden as the Tuscan sun set behind the olive trees, Dr. Romano reflected on what her research was revealing. We have spent so much effort trying to separate ourselves from nature, to develop healing technologies that don't depend on living systems. But perhaps the most sophisticated healing technologies have been growing all around us all along, waiting patiently for us to remember how to listen to their quiet wisdom. The language of flowers. The music becomes poetic and lyrical, with melodies that seem to dance like pollen on the wind. In the gardens of Giverny, where Claude Monet once painted his immortal water lilies, Dr. Emilie Dubois was discovering that the language of flowers was far more literal than poets had ever imagined. Working among the same beds that had inspired some of history's most beautiful art, she was documenting a complex system of chemical communication that revealed flowers to be sophisticated broadcasters, sending detailed messages through the air to anyone who could decode their aromatic signals. The morning mist rose from the lily pond, carrying with it the complex perfumes of hundreds of different flowers, each one contributing its own chemical voice to what Dubois was beginning to understand as an elaborate conversation conducted in molecules of scent. Every flower, Dubois explained to her research assistant as they moved through the garden with sensitive chemical analysis equipment, is broadcasting information about its species, its health, its reproductive readiness, and even its emotional state. The air around us is filled with messages we're only just learning to read. Dubois had been inspired by the work of Dr. Robert Ragusa at Cornell University, who had spent decades studying the chemical complexity of flower fragrances. Ragusa had discovered that flower scents were not simple, pleasant odors, but sophisticated chemical messages composed of dozens or even hundreds of different compounds, each one carrying specific information. A rose, Ragusa had written, doesn't just smell like a rose. It broadcasts a chemical resume that tells potential pollinators about its genetic quality, its nutritional resources, the time of day it's most receptive to pollination, and even whether it's already been visited by other pollinators. But Dubois was taking this research in a new direction, investigating whether plants could modulate their chemical communications in response to specific environmental conditions or social situations, essentially choosing what messages to send and when. Working with roses in Monet's garden, the descendants of the same varieties the artist had cultivated, Dr. Dubois was documenting how the chemical composition of rose fragrances changed throughout the day, across seasons, and in response to the presence of different pollinators and even human observers. "Watch this," she whispered, approaching a climbing rose that was just beginning to open its morning blooms. Using a portable gas chromatograph, she captured samples of the air around the flower. Then she returned an hour later to sample the same flower again. The results were remarkable. The flower had completely changed its chemical signature, adjusting the mixture of compounds it was releasing based on which pollinators had visited and which ones were currently in the area. The rose, Dubois realized with growing excitement, is actively managing its chemical communications, essentially having different conversations with different audiences. This discovery was part of a revolution in understanding how plants use chemical communication for far more than just attracting pollinators. Dr. Richard Carban, working at the University of California, Davis, had spent years documenting how plants use airborne chemical signals to warn neighbors about threats, coordinate defense responses, and even call for help from protective insects. Plants, Carban had discovered, are constantly eavesdropping on each other's chemical conversations and adjusting their own behavior based on the information they receive. A plant under attack by herbivores will release specific chemical signals that warn its neighbors to begin producing defensive compounds even before they're actually attacked. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this research was the discovery that plants could use chemical communication to coordinate their interactions with other species in ways that created mutually beneficial relationships. Dr. Ian Baldwin, working at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, had documented how wild tobacco plants could chemically summon specific predator insects to defend them from herbivore attacks. When attacked by hornworm caterpillars, the tobacco plants would release precise chemical signals that attracted hawkmoth predators, essentially hiring bodyguards to protect them. The plants, Baldwin observed,
or conducting sophisticated chemical negotiations with other species, offering rewards in exchange for protection services. They're managing ecosystem relationships through chemistry. This research was revealing that flower fragrances serve multiple functions simultaneously, attracting pollinators, repelling threats, communicating with neighboring plants, and coordinating beneficial relationships with protective species. Each flower was essentially a chemical radio station, broadcasting on multiple frequencies to different audiences. Dr. Dubois began to investigate whether humans might be unintentionally participating in these chemical conversations. Working with perfumers and aromatherapists, she analyzed how exposure to natural flower fragrances affected human physiology and psychology. What she found was evidence that humans had retained some ability to decode plant chemical signals, even if we weren't consciously aware of it. People exposed to the morning fragrances of jasmine showed different physiological responses than those exposed to evening jasmine fragrances, suggesting that humans could detect and respond to the subtle changes in plant chemical communications throughout the day. We may have lost the ability to consciously interpret plant chemical messages, but our bodies still respond to them. We're still part of the conversation, even if we've forgotten how to listen with full attention. This led to research into what aromatherapists had long claimed, that different plant fragrances could have specific, measurable effects on human health and well-being. But instead of attributing these effects to mystical properties, scientists were beginning to understand them as the result of chemical communication between plants and humans that had evolved over millions of years of coexistence. Dr. Hiroki Noce, working at the University of Tokyo, had identified specific compounds in lavender fragrance that interacted with human neurotransmitter systems, producing measurable anxiolytic effects. Rose fragrances contained compounds that seemed to modulate stress hormone production, and jasmine released molecules that appear to enhance cognitive function and emotional well-being.
Dr. Hiroki Noce, working at the University of Tokyo, had identified specific compounds in lavender fragrance that interacted with human neurotransmitter systems, producing measurable anxiolytic effects. Rose fragrances contained compounds that seemed to modulate stress hormone production. Jasmine released molecules that appeared to enhance cognitive function and emotional well-being. Plants, Noce realized, have evolved chemical compounds that can directly influence human physiology and psychology. They may be actively trying to modify our behavior in ways that benefit both species. This research was transforming the perfume industry, as chemists began to understand that traditional flower fragrances contain sophisticated blends of bioactive compounds that had been refined by millions of years of evolution to produce specific psychological effects. But perhaps the most profound discovery was that plants seemed to be able to learn and remember which chemical messages were most effective with different audiences. Dr. Marcel Dijk, working in the Netherlands, had documented cases where plants modified their chemical communications based on past interactions, essentially developing chemical vocabularies that were tailored to their specific ecological communities. Plants, Dijk observed, are not just broadcasting static chemical messages. They're engaged in dynamic chemical conversations that evolve over time based on feedback from their chemical partners. As researchers around the world continued to decode the chemical languages of plants, they were discovering a world of communication that was both more sophisticated and more beautiful than human language. A system of molecular poetry that had been written and rewritten by evolution for hundreds of millions of years. The timekeepers. The music becomes rhythmic and cyclical, suggesting the passage of time and natural rhythms. In the pristine laboratories of the University of Edinburgh, where Scottish mist pressed against tall windows and the scent of heather drifted across the campus, Dr. Andrew Miller was unraveling one of biology's most elegant mysteries: how plants keep perfect time without clocks, calendars, or any of the mechanical devices that humans need to track the passage of days, seasons, and years. The year was 2005, and Miller was working with a small, humble plant that had become the laboratory mouse of plant biology, Arabidopsis thaliana. In climate-controlled chambers where every variable could be precisely monitored,
He was discovering that this unremarkable weed possessed timekeeping mechanisms of extraordinary sophistication. "Look at this," Miller whispered to his colleague, pointing to traces on a computer monitor that showed the rhythmic expression of clock genes in the plant. Even in complete darkness, with no external time cues whatsoever, the plant's internal clock continued to tick with a precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker envious. The plant knows exactly what time it is, down to the minute. Miller's research was revealing that plants possessed not just one biological clock, but multiple interconnected timing systems that tracked everything from the 24-hour day-night cycle to annual seasonal changes, lunar cycles, and even multi-year environmental patterns. Plants, Miller realized as he watched the elegant dance of molecular clockwork in his experimental subjects, are living chronometers, constantly integrating temporal information from multiple sources to coordinate every aspect of their biology with the rhythms of the Earth. The molecular machinery of plant timekeeping was breathtakingly complex. Inside every plant cell, networks of genes turn on and off in precise sequences, creating oscillating patterns of protein production that served as the gears and springs of biological clocks. These molecular oscillators were so accurate that they could maintain precise 24-hour rhythms for weeks or even months without any external time cues. But what made plant clocks truly remarkable was their ability to integrate timing information with environmental conditions to make predictions about the future. Plants didn't just track time, they used temporal information to anticipate what was coming and prepare accordingly. Dr. Seth Davis, working at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, had discovered that plants could use their circadian clocks to predict dawn and begin photosynthesis before the sun actually rose, gaining a competitive advantage over plants that simply reacted to light. Plants, Davis observed, watching Arabidopsis leaves beginning to orient toward the east while it was still dark, are time travelers in a sense. They're constantly using information about past patterns to predict future conditions and position themselves advantageously in time. This predictive ability extended far beyond daily cycles. Plants could track seasonal changes with extraordinary precision, using day length, temperature patterns, and other environmental cues to predict the best times for flowering, seed production, and dormancy. Dr. Richard Amasano, working at the University of Wisconsin, had spent decades studying how plants measure the passage of seasons. He discovered that plants possess molecular calendars that track the accumulation of cold days during winter, allowing them to predict the arrival of spring with remarkable accuracy. A plant that flowers too early risks losing its reproductive investment to late frosts, Amasano explained, as he set up experimental plots where plants exposed to different temperature regimes were flowering at precisely predicted times. A plant that flowers too late misses the optimal window for pollination and seed development. Plants have evolved exquisite timing mechanisms to hit the seasonal sweet spot perfectly. But perhaps the most profound discovery was that plants could integrate multiple timescales simultaneously, creating what researchers called chronobiological integration systems that coordinated short-term responses with long-term strategies. Dr. Takeshi Mizuno, working in Japan, documented how rice plants could simultaneously track daily light cycles, seasonal temperature changes, and annual rainfall patterns to optimize their growth and reproduction timing. The plants were essentially performing complex temporal calculations, weighing multiple environmental variables to make optimal timing decisions. Plants, Mizuno marveled, are natural meteorologists and seasonal forecasters using sophisticated temporal analysis to predict the best times for every major life decision. The research into plant timing was also revealing the crucial role that circadian rhythms played in plant intelligence and decision-making. Dr. C. Robertson McClung, working at Dartmouth College, discovered that plants with disrupted circadian clocks showed impaired ability to respond appropriately to environmental challenges.
The circadian clock, McClung realized, is not just a timekeeping device, it's a temporal framework. that allows plants to coordinate all their other intelligent behaviors. Without proper timing, plant intelligence becomes chaotic and ineffective. This led to investigations into what researchers called chronobiological intelligence, the ability of plants to use temporal information to make smart decisions about resource allocation, growth strategies, and interaction with other organisms. Plants, it turned out, timed their activities to take advantage of daily fluctuations in pollinator activity, herbivore behavior, and resource availability. They could even time their chemical communications to coincide with periods when neighboring plants were most receptive to their messages. Dr. Stacy Harmer, working at UC Davis, discovered that plants adjusted the timing of their defensive responses based on when herbivore attacks were most likely to occur. Plants that were typically attacked by night-feeding insects would ramp up their defensive chemistry in the afternoon, preparing for the evening assault. Plants, Harmer observed, are temporal strategists, using their knowledge of time patterns to stay one step ahead of challenges and opportunities. The research was also revealing how plant timing systems could be disrupted by human activities, particularly climate change and artificial lighting. Plants in urban environments exposed to continuous artificial light showed disrupted circadian rhythms that affected their growth, reproduction, and ability to respond to environmental stress. Dr. Kevin Folta, working at the University of Florida, documented how light pollution was causing widespread disruptions to plant timing systems with consequences that rippled through entire ecosystems. We've inadvertently created a world where plants can no longer tell time accurately, Folta warned. This temporal chaos is affecting everything from pollination timing to seasonal migrations of animals that depend on plant cues. But the research was also opening up new possibilities for agriculture. By understanding how plant clocks worked, farmers could optimize planting times, irrigation schedules, and harvest timing to work in harmony with plants' natural rhythms. Dr. Shogo Ito, working in Japan, had developed agricultural techniques that used precise timing of light exposure to manipulate plant circadian clocks, allowing farmers to accelerate growth, improve nutritional content, and increase yields by synchronizing farming practices with plant temporal biology. When we work with plant time instead of against it, Ito explained, watching perfectly timed crops in his experimental fields, we can achieve results that seem almost magical. The plants become our partners in creating agricultural abundance. As researchers around the world continued to study plant chronobiology, they were uncovering timing mechanisms of such complexity and precision that they rivaled the most sophisticated human technologies. Plants, it seemed, had been master timekeepers long before humans invented their first sundials, and their biological chronometry represented one of evolution's greatest achievements in temporal engineering. Standing in his laboratory, as the Scottish night deepened outside, watching the endless oscillations of molecular clocks in his experimental plants, Dr. Millar reflected on the profound implications of this research. We measure time with machines, but plants are time. They have internalized the rhythms of the cosmos so completely that they have become living expressions of celestial mechanics, biological embodiments of the Earth's rotation and orbit around the Sun. The Green Renaissance. The music becomes triumphant and forward-looking, with harmonies that suggest new possibilities and hope. In laboratories and research stations around the world, as the third decade of the 21st century began to unfold, a quiet revolution was taking place that would transform humanity's relationship with the green world forever. Scientists, engineers, farmers, and visionaries were beginning to apply the discoveries about plant intelligence to create technologies and systems that seemed to come from the realm of dreams. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Dr. Michael Strano was leading a team that was creating plants capable of functioning as living sensors, communication devices, and even computers.
In his laboratory, spinach plants were detecting explosives in groundwater and sending email alerts to security personnel. Arugula was monitoring air pollution levels and transmitting data through modified chlorophyll that functioned as biological wireless transmitters. We're not just studying plant intelligence anymore, Strano explained to a gathering of amazed colleagues. These plants are becoming our colleagues in environmental monitoring, our partners in detecting threats, our collaborators in gathering information about the world around us. The technology, which Strano called plant nanobionics, involved introducing specially designed nanoparticles into plant tissues that could enhance or modify the plant's natural sensing capabilities. The result was living organisms that retained all their natural intelligence while gaining new abilities to interface with human technology. But perhaps even more remarkable were the agricultural applications emerging from the plant intelligence research. Dr. Pamela Ronald, working at UC Davis, had developed techniques that allowed farmers to communicate directly with their crops, monitoring plant health, stress levels, and needs through electronic interfaces that translated plant electrical signals into readable data. Imagine, Ronald suggested, standing in fields of sensor-equipped rice plants. If your crops could tell you exactly when they needed water, when they were being attacked by pests, when they were ready for harvest. We're creating agricultural systems where plants and humans work together as true partners.
These smart farming systems were revolutionizing agriculture in ways that were both high-tech and deeply ecological. Farmers using plant-computer interfaces were reducing water usage by up to 40%, cutting pesticide applications by 60%, and increasing yields by 25%, all by working with plant intelligence instead of against it. In the Amazon rainforest, Dr. Carlos Reinel was working with indigenous communities to combine traditional plant knowledge with modern sensing technologies. The result was a forest monitoring system where the trees themselves served as environmental sensors, using their natural sensitivity and communication networks to track deforestation, pollution, and unusual climate patterns in real time. The indigenous elders have always known that trees are aware, that the forest is intelligent, Reinel explained, watching data stream in from sensor-equipped trees throughout thousands of acres of rainforest. Now we're giving the forest a voice that the modern world can hear and understand. The project was creating an early warning system for forest health that was more sensitive and comprehensive than any satellite monitoring system. When the trees detected threats, illegal logging, pollution, unusual climate patterns, they could send immediate alerts through a combination of their natural communication networks and human-designed electronic interfaces. In hospitals around the world, the research into plant healing was being applied to create therapeutic environments that actively promoted recovery. Dr. Ching-Ching Li, working at Tokyo Medical University, had designed hospital rooms where carefully selected plants worked as living air purification systems, stress reduction devices, and even sources of therapeutic compounds that were released in precise doses based on patient needs. The plants, Li observed, monitoring both patient recovery rates and plant physiological responses in her therapeutic environments, are actively participating in the healing process. They sense patient stress levels and adjust their outputs accordingly, creating personalized therapeutic environments for each individual. These living healing systems were showing remarkable results. Patients in plant-integrated hospital rooms recovered 30% faster from surgery, required significantly less pain medication, and reported much higher satisfaction with their care experience. But perhaps the most visionary applications were emerging in architecture and urban planning. Architects around the world were designing buildings that incorporated living plant intelligence into their fundamental structure and operation. Dr. Rachel Armstrong, working at the University of Newcastle, was developing living architecture where buildings and plants formed integrated systems. These structures used plant intelligence to regulate temperature, air quality, and even structural integrity. Walls made of specially designed plant material composites could self-heal damage, adapt to changing conditions, and even grow stronger over time. We're creating buildings that are truly alive, Armstrong explained, standing in a prototype structure where the walls literally grew before visitors' eyes. These buildings can sense their environment, adapt to changing conditions, and even reproduce and evolve. They're architectural organisms. In cities around the world, urban planners were creating neural urban forests, networks of trees and plants that functioned as distributed intelligence systems for monitoring and managing urban environments. These green networks could detect pollution, regulate temperature, manage stormwater, and even provide early warning of natural disasters. Copenhagen had become the first city to implement a comprehensive urban plant intelligence system where trees throughout the city monitored air quality, traffic patterns, and citizen health indicators, providing data for optimizing everything from traffic flow to emergency response. The city has become a living organism, explained Dr. Lars Nielsen, Copenhagen's chief urban ecologist, walking through streets lined with sensor-equipped trees. The plants are the nervous system, constantly gathering information and helping us create a more livable, sustainable urban environment. The research into plant communication was also being applied to create new forms of art and music. Composers were creating symphonies based on the electrical patterns of plants. Artists were developing installations where plants controlled light and sound, and performers were learning to improvise with plant partners that responded to their movements and emotions. Dr. Maya Patel, working at the intersection of art and plant biology, had created performance systems where musicians and plants collaborated in real time, with the plant's electrical responses to the music influencing the composition as it was being performed. Music with plants, Patel explained, as audiences watched her perform duets with a collection of sensor-equipped ferns and orchids, is unlike anything humans have created before. The plants bring their own aesthetic sensibilities, their own timing, their own emotional responses to the collaboration. But perhaps the most profound applications were emerging in education. Schools around the world were developing curricula that taught students to collaborate with plant intelligence, using living classrooms where plants served as teachers, demonstrating principles of biology, ecology, chemistry, and even mathematics and physics. Students were learning to read plant electrical patterns, to understand chemical communications, to work with plant timing systems, and to participate in the vast networks of intelligence that connected all living things. We're teaching children, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, who had developed plant-based educational systems used in schools across 3 continents, to see themselves as part of the community of intelligence on Earth. They're learning that intelligence comes in many forms, and that cooperation with other forms of intelligence can achieve things that no single species could accomplish alone.
The whispering green. Imagine this. You are walking through a quiet forest at dusk. The air is cool, and the ground beneath your shoes is soft, with moss and fallen needles. The trees rise around you like silent guardians, pillars of time, older than memory. Shafts of golden light spill through gaps in the canopy, striping the forest floor in a patchwork of emerald shadows. The day is fading, but the world does not feel asleep. No, here in this hush of evening, you feel watched, not by eyes, but by something vaster. The leaves seem to lean toward you, as though curious. The ferns bend with the passing wind, their delicate fronds brushing against your arm as if in greeting. Somewhere in the undergrowth, a flower tilts its head toward the last warmth of the sun, closing its petals with deliberate grace. And you pause to wonder, are they aware of me? Do they feel this moment as I do? For most of our human story, we have walked through this green world as though it were a backdrop. Silent, passive, a stage upon which the drama of human life unfolded. We hunted and gathered, farmed and harvested, painted and prayed, all against the living canvas of forest and field. Plants were there to serve us, to feed us, to clothe us, to burn in our fires. But in quiet moments, When the wind settled and the leaves whispered, our ancestors sometimes felt the truth stir within them. Plants were not merely objects, they were companions, teachers, and perhaps in ways we could not yet measure, they were listening. This is the story of the secret life of plants. It is not a story told in shouts or thunder, but in whispers, in slow, patient growth, in seasons of weeding, in the gentle unfolding of petals and the silent weaving of roots. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, let us wander through this tale together, not as botanists or scientists, but as travelers seeking to understand the green souls that have always stood beside us. The silence that isn't silent. If you sit very still in a meadow, you may believe it is silent, but silence, like many things, is a matter of perspective. To the bee hovering near a violet, the world hums with vibration. To the roots pushing their way through soil, there is the slow crumble of stone, the moist whisper of earth. To the leaves trembling in the breeze, silence is threaded with constant movement. The silence of plants is not absence, but a different kind of presence. They speak in slower tongues, in languages of fragrance and shade, of touch and time. A vine does not leap, it curls. A tree does not shout, it leans. A flower does not march, it opens, and in its opening invites the world. For millennia, humans sensed this presence, but could not name it. We felt awe in sacred groves, reverence at the sight of a sprouting seed. We carved myths around trees and carried flowers to our dead. Deep in our memory, we knew that plants were not mute. They were simply speaking in a language we had forgotten how to hear. The first friendships. Imagine the earliest humans, long before writing, long before fire was tamed into hearths. They lived in a world of green, surrounded by leaves and branches, berries and seeds. Survival depended upon an intimate knowledge of plants, knowing which nourished and which poisoned, which healed and which harmed. To these early wanderers, plants were not abstract. They were friends, enemies, allies, and mysteries. The bitter root that soothed pain became a teacher. The fruit that glittered with promise but delivered sickness became a warning. The tall tree that offered shade, shelter, and fruit was a guardian. And because our ancestors lived so close to the rhythms of the earth, they began to weave stories around plants. A tree was not merely wood, it was a spirit, a god, a mother. A flower was not merely petals, it was love embodied or sorrow made visible. A seed was not merely food, it was rebirth, a tiny miracle that defied the stillness of winter to burst forth in spring. Long before science, we gave plants voices in our myths. Perhaps deep inside, we always suspected that they already had voices of their own. Time measured in green. Plants live in a scale of time that we, with our rushing hearts, often struggle to notice. A tree can live for centuries, watching generations rise and fall. A bristlecone pine, gnarled and twisted by desert winds, can live for nearly 5,000 years, older than the pyramids, older than writing itself. To such a being, our lives must seem like sparks, brief flashes of light in a long night. A seed can wait in the earth for decades, even centuries,
before the right conditions awaken it. In 2005, scientists revived a date palm seed that had lain dormant for nearly 2,000 years, coaxing it back into life. Imagine the patience of that seed, biding its time while empires rose and fell, while languages were born and forgotten, until at last a drop of water touched it, and it stirred awake. In this way, plants remind us that life does not always move at human speed. There are other rhythms, slower and deeper, woven into the soil itself. To learn from plants is to learn to wait. The green gaze.
These traditions remind us of something we often forget in the modern world, that plants were not passive objects, they were alive, aware, and worthy of relationship. The healing leaves. From the beginning, humans noticed that plants could heal. Imagine a woman in an ancient village watching her child shiver with fever. She remembers that a certain root, bitter but strong, had eased her mother's pain years before. She digs it up, grinds it, mixes it with water, and prays as she places it upon her child's lips. Slowly, the fever breaks. Relief washes over her, not just as a mother, but as a student of the green world. Everywhere, across every land, humans learned the medicines of plants. The Egyptians wrote of willow bark, which soothed pain, the same plant that would one day give birth to aspirin. The Sumerians praised poppy, whose milky sap brought dreams and ease from suffering. In India, the system of Ayurveda wove plants into a philosophy of balance, where turmeric, neem, and holy basil still carry sacred weight. Plants became teachers, healers, companions, and often their healing power was seen as a gift from gods or spirits. To drink an herbal potion was not only medicine, it was communion with the green soul of the earth. Flowers of love and mourning. Even flowers, delicate and fleeting, became vessels of meaning. In ancient Greece, the red rose was linked to Aphrodite, goddess of love. A single bloom carried the weight of passion, desire, and beauty. Yet the same rose, when placed on a grave, spoke of sorrow and remembrance. Love and loss intertwined in its petals. The lotus of Egypt opened each morning with the sun, sinking each evening with the night. To the Egyptians, it symbolized rebirth, eternity, the endless rising of the soul. Its form was carved into temples and painted onto tombs, a promise that death was not the end. Across the world, flowers spoke a language older than writing. They carried messages in silence. A daisy meant innocence. A lily meant purity. A marigold meant grief. Even when humans lacked words, they could place a flower in someone's hand and be understood. Plants as gods and teachers. In many cultures, plants were not only sacred, but divine. Among the Maya, maize was more than food, it was the very substance of humanity. Their creation story told of gods shaping the first humans out of corn dough, giving them life from the same grain that sustained their people. To eat maize was to partake of the body of the gods, a ritual repeated with every meal. In the Amazon, shamans drank the brew of ayahuasca, a vine mixed with leaves that opened visions. They believed the plants themselves were teachers, whispering truths about the universe through dreams and songs. The vine was not medicine alone. It was a spirit guide, a doorway into realms unseen.
Even in Greece, the god Dionysus was tied to the vine. Grapes, transformed into wine, became not just drink, but ecstasy, a means of touching the divine. Through the plant, mortals stepped into communion with gods. Why myths matter? You may wonder, listening now, why these old stories matter. After all, we live in an age of microscopes and satellites, where the secrets of plants are studied not through prayer, but through experiment. Why return to the myths of dryads, world trees, and sacred corn? Because myths tell us something that science alone cannot. They reveal how humans felt. They show us that from the very beginning, we sensed a mystery in plants, a presence beyond utility. Our ancestors wrapped that mystery in stories, in gods and spirits, in rituals and reverence. And though their explanations were wrapped in imagination, their intuition was not wrong. Today, as science reveals the hidden communications of roots, the electrical pulses of leaves, and the symbiotic intelligence of forests, we begin to see what our ancestors always suspected, that the green world is alive in ways we are only beginning to understand. A whisper from the past. Picture again that ancient campfire. The flames crackle, sending sparks into the night. Around it sit men and women, their faces lit with gold. A storyteller lifts his voice, weaving a tale of a tree that holds the world, of flowers that bloom from the blood of gods, of spirits that dwell in the forest beyond. Children listen wide-eyed, adults nod in solemn memory. Above them, the trees sway gently in the dark. Do the leaves rustle with the night wind? Or are they answering the story, whispering back to the people who honor them? We cannot know, but perhaps it does not matter. What matters is this: from the very beginning of our human journey, we did not walk alone. We walked with the green ones. They fed us, healed us, taught us, and just maybe, they listened. And so our story continues, winding forward through time. From myth to medicine, from ritual to science, we follow the thread of how humans have sought to understand the secret life of plants. The roots of that story are ancient, buried deep in the soil of memory. And now as we step into the next chapter, we will see how plants became not just symbols of myth, but practical teachers, offering food, shelter, and lessons written in leaf and branch. The whispers of the ancient roots still echo, and if we are quiet enough, perhaps we can hear them even now.
The Whispering Healers. The year is 2700 BCE. In the bustling valleys of ancient Mesopotamia. The air carries the weight of 1,000 prayers, whispered to gods carved in stone, but beneath those grand offerings lies something quieter, gentler, and no less powerful: the humble roots, leaves, and blossoms of plants. Imagine a young scribe in the city of Ur, his reed stylus hovering over a clay tablet. He writes carefully: poppy for pain, willow bark for fever, garlic for the stomach. These are not random scratches, but the birth of something enduring. Humanity's first attempts at cataloging the whispering healings of plants. For thousands of years, people turned to nature as their apothecary. Plants were not simply green things in the fields. They were companions in survival. The bitter chew of willow bark was not enjoyed, but it cooled the fire of fever. The thick resin of frankincense soothed inflamed chests and lungs. The small purple flowers of lavender, when rubbed between palms and inhaled, brought the anxious heart a little closer to peace. In Egypt, priests of Sekhmet guarded the scrolls of plant remedies like holy secrets. Honey was mixed with herbs to heal wounds, while aloe, with its cool gel, was placed on burned skin to draw out the sting of the desert sun. Papyrus scrolls like the Ebers papyrus became early medical textbooks, detailing more than 700 plant-based remedies. To the ancient mind, illness was not merely physical, it was spiritual. A fever was a curse, a cough a punishment, and the right leaf, flower, or root was believed to carry divine power to chase away both spirit and sickness. Plants were not only healers of the body, but bridges to the invisible. The Greeks would later refine this. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, declared, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." He saw the garden not as a pantry, but as a pharmacy. Mint for digestion, fennel for mothers nursing their children, rosemary to sharpen the memory. For him, healing was not found in iron instruments or complex rituals, but in respecting the wisdom already coded in the veins of plants. And in faraway India, the Sanskrit verses of the Ayurvedic texts described the balancing of life forces through herbs. Turmeric for inflammation, neem for cleansing, tulsi, the holy basil, for spiritual purification. Plants were not just seen as tools, but as living embodiments of balance, as if nature herself whispered lessons of harmony through their leaves. If you were to walk through a village centuries ago, you might see an elder woman crouched by a fire, stirring a pot of herbs. Her hands, wrinkled by time, knew which leaves to boil, which roots to crush, which flowers to dry. Her remedies came not from laboratories, but from memory, passed down like treasured lullabies through generations. And so, plants became not only healers of wounds, but companions in suffering. They held the grief of mothers, the groans of warriors, the prayers of the sick, and the fragile hopes of the dying. They whispered healing softly, patiently, faithfully. Because long before medicine became science, it was trust in the quiet mercy of plants. The Garden of Spirit and Myth. Close your eyes and imagine a sacred grove in ancient Greece. The air is fragrant with laurel and pine, the soft crunch of leaves beneath the sandals of pilgrims carrying questions for the oracle at Delphi. Plants were never mere background scenery to these rituals. They were sacred bridges to gods. The ancients saw in plants what we often forget: personality, mystery, even divinity. Take the oak tree. To the Celts, the oak was not simply wood, it was the axis mundi, the world's backbone, standing tall as a ladder between earth and heaven. Druids held ceremonies beneath its sprawling branches, believing the mistletoe that grew upon it carried magical healing powers. Or consider the lotus of ancient Egypt. Each dawn its blue petals unfurled with the rising sun, only to close again at dusk. To Egyptians it was the perfect symbol of rebirth, the daily resurrection of life itself. No wonder it appeared carved onto temple walls and painted onto sarcophagi, a promise that death, too, would one day blossom into life again. And in Greece, the story of Daphne and Apollo revealed how plants became eternal through myth. Pursued relentlessly by the god of light, Daphne cried for escape, and the earth transformed her into a laurel tree. Her branches became a shield, her leaves the crown of poets and victors.
Through her, the Greeks believed that plants held the power to immerase even human sorrow. Mind tool medicine takes on this ancient wisdom by blending true grand science with soulful whispers.
The first botanists, ancient civilizations and the study of plants. As human societies grew, the casual knowledge of plants became something more. It became study. It became discipline. It became what we would one day call botany. But in the beginning, botany was not separated from life. It was part of healing, of farming, of worship. To know a plant was to know the world, to touch the divine, to hold power over life and death. Egypt, the land of papyrus and lotus. In the fertile valley of the Nile, plants shaped civilization itself. Papyrus was not just a plant, it was a revolution. From its stalks, Egyptians made the first paper, upon which they wrote prayers, records, and poems that carried their voices across millennia. The blue lotus, sacred and beautiful, symbolized rebirth. Its flowers opened with the morning sun and closed with the night, mirroring the cycle of death and resurrection. Priests placed it in tombs, hoping its power would guide souls to eternal life. Egyptian medicine, too, was rich with plants. Scrolls record the use of garlic for strength, coriander for digestion, pomegranate for parasites. To the Egyptians, plants were not mere tools, they were gifts of the gods. India, the science of Ayurveda. Far to the east, in India, another great tradition blossomed. Ayurveda, the science of life, saw plants as part of a cosmic balance. Turmeric was not only a spice, but a purifier of blood. Neem was bitter but sacred, a defender against illness. Tulsi, or holy basil, was revered as a goddess herself, standing at the doorways of homes as a guardian of health. These plants were not isolated remedies, but part of a philosophy of harmony between body, mind, spirit, and earth. To heal was not to silence a symptom, but to restore balance. China, the roots of medicine. In China, the legendary emperor Shennong was said to have tasted hundreds of herbs to discover their properties. His findings were gathered in the Shennong Ben Sao Jing, one of the earliest pharmacopoeias in the world. Ginseng gave vitality, tea cleared the mind, ginger warmed the body. Each plant carried not only physical effects, but spiritual qualities, woven into the Taoist view of harmony between opposites, yin and yang. Plants here were more than medicine, they were philosophy in living form. Greece, from myth to science. In Greece, plants stood at the crossroads of myth and science. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, taught that disease was not a curse from gods, but an imbalance in the body, and that plants could restore that balance. He spoke of garlic, willow, and herbs still known today. Theophrastus, student of Aristotle, wrote entire books on plants, describing their forms, growth, and uses. He is often called the father of botany. His works remind us that even in the ancient world, humans were not content with myth alone. They wanted to understand, to classify, to observe. Knowledge shared, knowledge lost. Across cultures, knowledge of plants blossomed, but knowledge is fragile. Wars burned libraries, empires crumbled, scrolls were lost. Yet through it all, the memory of plants endured. Seeds carried across trade routes, herbs whispered from healer to healer, fragments of ancient wisdom reaching us even now. The first botanists may not have called themselves scientists, but their work was the beginning of humanity's long journey of listening carefully to the green world.
The secret language, symbolism, folklore, and human emotions in plants. As humans studied plants with science, they never stopped weaving them into the fabric of story, love, and meaning. Plants spoke not only to the body, but to the soul. Flowers as words. Imagine a world without writing. How do you say, "I love you," without words? How do you confess sorrow, or forgiveness, or longing? You give a flower. In Victorian England, this became an art known as floriography. A red rose meant passion. A white lily meant purity. A violet meant loyalty. A sprig of rosemary whispered remembrance. Lovers exchanged bouquets like secret letters, each flower chosen for the message it carried. But this language was far older than the Victorians. In every culture, flowers became metaphors, vessels of emotion. The cherry blossoms of Japan spoke of life's fleeting beauty. The marigolds of Mexico carried prayers for the dead during Dia de los Muertos. The olive branch of Greece offered peace. Plants were not only food or medicine, they were emotion given form. Trees as memory. Trees, too, carried meanings. An oak was strength, endurance, a guardian that outlived generations. A cypress was mourning, planted in graveyards to mark loss. A palm was victory, carried in triumphal processions. To sit beneath a tree was not just to rest, it was to step into a symbol, a story larger than oneself. Folklore of roots and leaves. In folklore, plants often bridge the world of humans and spirits. Mandrake roots, shaped like tiny people, were said to scream when pulled from the earth. Clover carried luck if 4 leaves appeared instead of 3. Elder trees were believed to house fairies, and cutting one without permission risked angering them. These tales may sound fanciful, yet they reveal something profound. Humans sensed that plants were more than material. They were thresholds to mystery, reminders that the world is alive with unseen presence. Why do we turn to plants in moments of deep feeling? Why do we place flowers at graves, give roses on anniversaries, plant trees in memory of those we love? Perhaps because plants embody what we cannot say. They are beauty without words, endurance without noise, grace without effort. They remind us that love, grief, joy, and remembrance are not always to be spoken, but to be lived, silently, like a flower opening to the sun.
In India, the peepal tree, beneath which the Buddha attained enlightenment, became more than bark and leaf. It became the throne of awakening. Its roots, stretching deep into the soil, mirrored the spiritual quest, digging into the unseen, anchoring truth, drawing nourishment from silence. Across the world, indigenous traditions echoed similar reverence. In the Americas, tobacco was not a vice, but a sacred gift, its smoke carrying prayers into the sky. In Australia, eucalyptus leaves were burned in cleansing ceremonies, the smoke believed to drive away evil spirits. In every corner of the earth, plants were woven into rituals, into myths, into the very rhythm of human imagination. But perhaps the most haunting myths were those that warned of forgetting this bond. Legends spoke of enchanted forests, where trees whispered secrets and punished those who cut too greedily. Folktales told of vines that trapped the arrogant, flowers that lured men to their doom, and roots that concealed ancient curses. Through these stories, humanity remembered. Plants were not to be owned. They were to be honored. In myth, plants were teachers. They spoke through allegory, through story, through symbolism.
And though we may smile at these old tales today, they carry a truth our ancestors grasped more deeply than we sometimes do. That the green life around us is not silent. It speaks in symbols, in spirit, in myth. The silent partnership. Let us step forward into the Middle Ages. Europe is cloaked in shadowy forests, its villages clustered around castles and cathedrals. And in these villages, behind stone walls, like gardens, tended not for beauty, but for survival. These were not idle spaces, but lifelines. Monasteries became the guardians of plant knowledge when much of Europe had forgotten it. Monks bent over small plots of soil, hands in the earth, tending to thyme, sage, and chamomile. These gardens were laboratories of faith and medicine. Their neat rows of herbs supplied both the sick in infirmaries and the tired souls who sought comfort in prayer. The partnership between human and plant deepened in these cloisters. Books like De Materia Medica, written centuries earlier by the Greek physician Dioscores, were copied at candlelight, ensuring the wisdom of plants survived wars, plagues, and the fall of empires. Beyond monastery walls, farmers too relied on this partnership. They learned which crops thrived together, how beans replenished soil after wheat, how marigolds deterred pests. Though they lacked our science, their intuition was guided by observation, patience, and respect for the rhythms of nature. But the Middle Ages were also marked by fear. When the Black Death swept across Europe, desperate hearts turned to plants for hope. Herbs were stuffed into masks of plague doctors. Rosemary and juniper burned to cleanse the air. Garlic hung in doorways as protection. Some remedies worked, some did not. But in each leaf was held the belief that nature itself could stand against death. It was also a time when the line between medicine and magic blurred. The cunning women of villages carried knowledge of herbs that rivaled the learned doctors. To some, they were healers, to others, witches. For their wisdom, many paid a terrible price. Yet their memory lives on, reminding us of the risks carried by those who listened most closely to plants.
The breath of the forest. The morning mist clung to the earth like a soft blanket, the air heavy with dew, carrying the perfume of soil, pine, and unseen blossoms. Deep inside the forest, silence reigned, yet it was not an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that trembled with hidden life, filled with rustles, tiny heartbeats, and the invisible sighs of trees exchanging whispers through the air. To the wandering human eye, this forest seemed still. But within the hidden architecture of leaves and stems, there was a dance taking place, one so constant, so quiet, that we rarely notice it at all. It is the dance of breath. Plants, after all, are not as passive as they appear. They breathe with us, in us, and for us. Inhaling the sunlight, they weave it into sugars. Exhaling oxygen, they gift us life. Every breath you have ever taken, every rise and fall of your chest has been tethered to the invisible labor of plants. Let us imagine for a moment, not as scientists, but as dreamers. Picture a single tree, perhaps an oak or a eucalyptus, stretching its limbs to the sky. Each leaf is like a tiny lung, green and delicate, opening to the sun. Through its surface, unseen portals open and close. Stomata, mouths that breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out the oxygen you now draw into your lungs. Isn't it strange, when you think about it, that your inhale is their exhale? That your very life is locked in a rhythm with the unseen pulse of green? Long ago, the earth had no such breath. The skies were hostile, heavy with carbon dioxide, with no oxygen to nourish future creatures. But it was plants, tiny, ancient cyanobacteria drifting in the oceans that transformed everything. They began their quiet work of photosynthesis, and over millions of years, they filled the atmosphere with oxygen. We live not simply because of plants, but because of their patience, their slow, unyielding gift. And perhaps, if you close your eyes at night, you can almost hear it, the forest inhaling and exhaling, the slow heartbeat of chlorophyll, the soft and endless hymn of life itself. This breath, this unseen connection binds us all together. It is not just a cycle of chemistry, it is a shared intimacy. Each time we exhale carbon dioxide, we offer it back as nourishment. Each time they exhale oxygen, they return the gift. We breathe each other into existence. And this truth, once realized, changes the way we walk in the world. The next time you stand near a tree, remember, it is not a stranger. It is a partner in your every breath. The hidden conversations. Imagine now, deep beneath your feet, where roots stretch like fingers into the dark. Down there in the hushed and hidden earth, another world exists, one where plants whisper not through sound, but through an underground web of touch and exchange. Scientists have discovered something both astonishing and strangely poetic. Plants talk to one another. Not in words, of course, but in signals, in pulses of chemistry, in the soft glow of biochemistry beneath the soil. At the heart of this network lies the mycorrhizal fungi, a thread-like kingdom of beings that connect root to root, tree to tree. These fungi act like messengers, weaving a network so vast and so ancient that it has been called the Wood Wide Web. Through this silent internet, plants send warnings, share nutrients, and even nurture their young. Picture it, a great oak, tall and wise, sensing danger in the gnawing of caterpillars on its leaves. Through its roots, it sends a signal, carried by the fungi to nearby trees, and soon those neighbors begin producing bitter chemicals in their leaves, preparing themselves against the coming attack. In another moment, a dying tree, its leaves brittle, its bark fading, sends its final sugars into the ground, feeding its kin. Even in death, it chooses to give, ensuring that the forest lives on. When you walk in a forest, you are walking upon a living conversation. Invisible threads stretch beneath you, carrying stories of warning, of generosity, of survival. The ground is alive with messages you will never hear, but which guide the very shape of the forest above. And yet, beyond the scientific wonder, there is something profoundly emotional in this realization. We often think of kindness and cooperation as uniquely human virtues, but here, in the darkness of the soil, plants remind us that generosity is older than our species, that even in silence, life leans toward connection. Isn't that what we long for too? To be seen, to be connected, to be nourished by a web greater than ourselves. Perhaps this is why humans feel so at peace in the forest. Perhaps our own roots remember.
The language of light. We now turn our gaze upward, to the shimmering leaves that tremble in the sunlight. For plants, light is not merely illumination, it is language, nourishment, and rhythm. They do not simply bask in it, they read it, they measure it, they live by it. Each dawn is like a conversation. The angle of the sun, the length of the day, the quality of the light, all of these are signals that plants interpret with astonishing precision. In spring, as days grow longer, seeds awaken, buds unfurl, flowers emerge. It is not magic, but light itself whispering, now is the time to grow. In autumn, as the sun lowers and days shorten, another message is delivered.
Leaves begin to withdraw their green, revealing the fiery reds, oranges, and golds that were always hidden within. It is light that tells them, prepare for sleep. This sensitivity to light is woven into the very fabric of their being. Within each plant lies a clock, not of gears or numbers, but of proteins and cells that keeps time with the turning of the earth. Circadian rhythms, we call them, and they are not so different from ours. Have you ever noticed how certain flowers close at night only to reopen with the sun? The morning glory, for example, unfurls its delicate trumpet as dawn breaks, as if greeting the world anew. By dusk, it curls back into itself, resting until the next cycle begins. Plants, it seems, are poets of the sun. And we too are shaped by light. Our moods lift with dawn, falter in darkness, bloom under the warmth of summer. In this way, plants and humans are kin. We both lean toward the light, longing for its touch, growing restless in its absence. But there is something even more mysterious here. Light does not only guide plants, it feeds them. Through the alchemy of photosynthesis, sunlight is transformed into sugar, into energy, into the very fuel of life. Every grain of rice, every apple, every loaf of bread is sunlight, captured and stored. When you eat, you're eating light. Pause with that thought. The warmth of the sun, the rays that touched your skin, now live within you, pass down through leaf and fruit and seed. The secret life of plants is in truth the secret life of light. A dialogue written in wavelengths, an intimacy so constant we forget it is there. And perhaps the next time you step into the sun, you will remember that you are not merely standing in its glow. You are part of an eternal conversation, one that binds plants, animals, and human beings in the soft and endless radiance of light, radiance of light. The silent architects of air. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing on the edge of an ancient forest. The year is not ours. It is millions of years ago. The air is thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of wet earth, and the world around you is lush, untamed, and impossibly green. Towering ferns stretch toward the pale sun, moss creeps across stones like green velvet, giant horsetails rise in groves like natural cathedrals, their hollow stems whispering when the wind passes through them. It is here, in this primordial time, that plants are not just surviving, they are shaping the very air you are breathing. Without leaves, without flowers, without the forms we know today, they are performing their secret alchemy. Through the green pigment of chlorophyll, these ancient plants are drinking light and releasing oxygen, invisibly sculpting the chemistry of Earth's atmosphere. The world had not always been so kind to life. In the early days of our planet, oxygen was scarce, trapped in rocks and minerals, almost absent from the sky. Life clung to watery corners, hidden and microscopic, fragile. But plants, first algae, then mosses, ferns, and trees, changed everything. They were architects of the unseen, building a world where animals could breathe, where lungs could expand, where futures could be written. Pause and feel that for a moment. Every breath you take, every quiet rise and fall of your chest is an inheritance from this silent revolution. Plants gave us breath, and in doing so, they gave us the possibility of love, language, music, and memory. And yet they did it all without asking for recognition, without sound or applause. Their gift was quiet, steady, patient, like the patience of green things.
But plants did not only transform the sky, they shaped the ground beneath our feet. Their roots broke through stone, turning rock into soil. Their fallen leaves decayed, returning minerals to the earth. Slowly, layer by layer, forests built the fertile ground that would one day feed civilizations. If you listen closely to the forest now, in your imagination, you may almost hear them working. The sigh of leaves exhaling oxygen, the rustle of ferns returning life to the soil, the hush of roots drinking water from the deep. It is a music too slow for human ears, yet it is always playing, always present. Plants, in their secret way, are not only givers of life, they are the ancient authors of possibility. Every field of wheat, every orchard of apples, every garden rose is part of this long story. And so, the next time you breathe deeply beneath a tree, remember, the air itself is a gift written leaf by leaf across time. The wisdom of healing leaves. Now let us drift into another scene. Imagine a fire crackling low in the night, casting amber shadows against the walls of a cave. A figure sits nearby, their hands holding a bundle of herbs, the air scented with sage, pine, and bitter roots. Long before science, before laboratories, plants were medicine, and humans learned their secrets by watching, tasting, and listening. Plants, you see, carry memory within their chemistry. Some leaves hold bitterness that drives away disease. Some roots store energy and strength. Some flowers soothe the mind with fragrance. To our ancestors, every plant was a teacher, a mystery waiting to be read. The first healers, the shamans, herbalists, wise women, and elders, were the translators of this secret plant language. They noticed that willow bark eased fever and pain. They found that peppermint soothed the stomach, that lavender calmed the restless, that garlic protected against infection. They observed animals too, how a sick deer chewed certain roots, how birds carried herbs into their nests. The forest was their pharmacy, and every leaf a prescription written in green. But beyond the practical, there was always something more, something sacred. Plants were not merely remedies, they were companions in healing. Drinking a tea was not only medicine, but communion. To eat a berry, to chew a root, was to take into oneself a fragment of Earth's wisdom. Even now, in our world of pills and machines, the roots of this relationship remain. Aspirin owes its power to willow bark. Quinine, the treatment for malaria, was born from the bark of the cinchona tree. Countless medicines trace their lineage back to plants. And perhaps that is why the act of brewing tea, of sipping warm liquid from a cup, still feels so profoundly comforting. It is more than hydration. It is a ritual older than memory, a gesture of trust in the green world. When you sit quietly with a cup of chamomile or peppermint, you are not just drinking, you are participating in an ancient conversation, one where plants speak softly of healing and humans listen with gratitude. Plants heal not only the body, but also the heart. A walk among pines can ease sorrow. The fragrance of jasmine can stir joy. A field of sunflowers can remind us of light, even on days of darkness. They tend to the invisible wounds too, the ones that doctors cannot always see. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine yourself lying in a meadow surrounded by the quiet chorus of plants. Imagine the scent of lavender calming your mind, the taste of mint refreshing your spirit, the sound of leaves whispering you toward rest. For in the end, the secret life of plants is not only about survival, but about their enduring desire to keep us whole. The sacred groves of memory. Let us wander now into the realms of story and myth, for plants are not only biological beings, they are symbols woven into the spiritual fabric of humanity.
Across the ancient world, forests were temples, and trees were more than trees. The oak was sacred to Zeus. The ash tree linked the heavens and earth in Norse myth. The Bodhi tree sheltered the Buddha in his awakening. In every culture, plants became vessels of meaning, bridges between the mortal and the eternal. Imagine walking into a sacred grove of the Celts. The air is thick with reverence, every rustle of leaves a whisper from the gods. Druids gather beneath oaks, their rituals guided by the belief that trees are guardians of wisdom. To harm such a tree was not just destruction, it was sacrilege. Travel eastward in your imagination, and you find yourself in India, where banyan trees stretch their roots like pillars of eternity. Villages grow around them, their shade a place of counsel, rest, and devotion. To sit beneath such a tree is to feel time slowing, to sense the quiet heartbeat of the universe.
The music becomes transcendent and peaceful, with all the earlier themes weaving together in a final, harmonious resolution. As our long journey through the secret life of plants draws to a close, imagine yourself once again in that quiet forest where our story began. But now, with everything we have learned, the silence has become a symphony, and the stillness has revealed itself to be constant motion, constant communication, constant thought. The morning sun filters through leaves that are not just gathering light, but processing information, making decisions, sharing resources, and engaging in conversations that span continents and centuries. The roots beneath your feet are not just seeking water and nutrients, but participating in networks of intelligence that dwarf the complexity of our human internet. Every breath you take carries molecular messages from the plants around you, chemical words in languages we are only beginning to understand, but that our bodies still remember from millions of years of evolutionary partnership. The flowers that perfume the air are not just beautiful, they are speaking, broadcasting complex information about their needs, their gifts, their willingness to collaborate with any creature wise enough to listen. The trees that tower above you are not solitary individuals competing for sunlight, but members of ancient communities that have been sharing resources, raising children together, and accumulating wisdom for longer than human civilizations have existed. They are timekeepers and memory holders, living libraries of environmental knowledge, patient teachers who have been waiting for us to develop the humility and the technology to hear their lessons. In discovering the secret life of plants, we have not just learned about another form of consciousness, we have discovered that we were never alone. We have always been part of a vast community of intelligent beings, a planetary conversation that we temporarily forgot how to hear but never actually left. The plants that surround us in our homes, our gardens, our cities, and our wilderness areas are not just decorations or resources or passive background to human activity. They are our partners in creating and maintaining the living systems that support all life on Earth. They are our teachers in sustainability, our collaborators in healing, our guides in learning how to live as part of something larger than ourselves. As we move forward into an uncertain future, facing challenges of climate change, environmental degradation, and social disconnection, the secret life of plants offers us more than just scientific knowledge. It offers us a new way of being in the world, a way that recognizes intelligence wherever it appears, that values cooperation over domination, that understands healing as a collaborative process, and that sees time in terms of centuries rather than moments. The plants are showing us how to build networks of mutual support that can last for millennia, how to share resources fairly across communities, how to respond to challenges with resilience and adaptation rather than destruction and waste. They're demonstrating forms of intelligence that are patient where we are hurried, generous where we are selfish, and wise where we are merely clever. Perhaps most importantly, they are reminding us that we are not separate from nature but part of it, participants in a vast, intelligent, living system that has been growing and learning for billions of years. We are not visitors in the natural world, we are members of it, with roles to play and contributions to make to the larger conversation of life on Earth. In learning to listen to the secret life of plants, we begin to remember our own secret life as part of the living Earth. We begin to understand that our technologies and our cultures and our dreams are not separate from the biological intelligence that surrounds us, but expressions of it, contributions to it, ways of participating more fully in the ancient conversation of consciousness that began with the first plant cell and continues in every leaf that rustles, every flower that blooms, every root that reaches through the soil in search of connection. The secret life of plants, it turns out, is not a secret at all. It is the most open secret in the universe, written in every blade of grass, whispered by every breeze through the leaves, broadcast by every flower that opens to the sun. It has been waiting patiently for us to remember how to read it, how to hear it, how to join it. Welcome home to the conversation that never ended. Welcome back to the intelligence that was always your own.